Good evening, everybody. I see that a lot of you are old hat at this already, and you're already dropping information in chat, so that's fantastic. And I see a handful of people that have been here in previous sessions, which is great to have you back. Some people I've been in meetings with this week already, which is cool too. So I'm very happy to see everybody that is joining us this evening. If this is your first time, welcome to the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm Ron Kursop, and I'll be your host tonight. We'll be covering ethics, conflict of interest, intellectual freedom, censorship, and privacy this evening. As always, this program began with the intention to provide insights for the more than 6,000 library trustees in New York State. Each session takes a deeper dive into one chapter of the trustee handbook and answers real-life questions received from the field that arise in the area of governance of work of library boards. So to start out, like I said, a lot of you have already taken the cue from previous sessions, but when we are looking at the chat box in the lower portion of your screen, we can, if you wouldn't mind, we would love to have you put in your name, your library, and how long you've been at the library. That would be really great. There's also a Q&A button down there, but we'll get to that in just a second. First, I would like to thank all of our promotional sponsors. Before we get too far into the program tonight, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge our co-promotional sponsors. Thank you to New York State Library, the Public Library Directors Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. Without you, this program would not have reached the number of trustees it already has. So thank you so much. We appreciate you talking up the program, and each session has been an extremely high amount of fun, and we have a ton of trustees that we've been talking to, and it's raised a lot of questions, which we hope to continue to answer. So for tonight, we will be discussing the section of the trustee handbook that deals with ethics and conflict of interest, and we'll also be touching on intellectual freedom, censorship, and privacy. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll receive an overview of the topic from Jerry and Rebecca. They'll also provide answers to the frequently asked questions sent in advance by our viewers. Following that, I will facilitate an open Q&A by those in attendance tonight. And you'll notice at the bottom of your screen that there's a Q&A button. When you have questions that you would like to ask, please use this feature. It's the best way that we can keep tabs on all the questions that are answered. We may not be able to get to all the questions that are in that section tonight, but add them there and we'll do our best to get to them, or we'll save them if we're unable to see if we can answer them again in the future. I would like to introduce the authors of the trustee handbook. But before that, I want to give a quick shout out to our behind the scenes support. Casey Conlin is here. Hey, Casey. He's been making sure that all of these items are running smoothly for us as we've been moving forward through these various sessions. And then my co-moderator, Brian Hildreth, who you saw last month on his work when he was working with Jerry and Rebecca. Thank you guys for being here again to support, as well as doing everything that you're doing. We're joined this evening by the authors of the Trustee Handbook, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich and Jerry Nichols. Rebecca is the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, and along with co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she also authored a companion handbook for new library directors in New York State, and the Municipal Ballot How-To Guide, as well as 3 other books in ALA edition. So very happy to have Rebecca here. Jerry Nichols, our distinguished guest himself, as leader in the public library services as library director, library system directors, and library educators. He's also considered one of New York State's most authoritative experts in library management, finance, law, and construction. In an article that I recently wrote, I had said that Rebecca and Jerry basically have filled my brain with everything that I know about libraries, and I stand by that. They're 2 very fantastic people to listen to when it comes to libraries. And as a special guest tonight, we have Sarah Dallas, who is the director of, she's director of the Southern Adirondack Library System. And we've asked her to join us because of her work with the American Library Association and the focus on intellectual freedom, we're hoping that she can help us out a little bit with talking about intellectual freedom, censorship, and privacy as those questions come up. So this time, I'd like to invite Rebecca and Jerry to kick us off with this installment of the Trustee Book Club. Take it away, you two.
All right. Well, as always, thank you, Ron, for moderating. We always appreciate your high spirit and complimentary nature towards us. It always makes our life a little easier. And thank you also to Casey and Brian, who help are part of our team keeping this program going. And Sarah, we're so excited to have her here with us tonight to help with some of our questions about book challenges. And I have to say, when we put this program lineup together, we certainly didn't anticipate how hot a topic book challenges would be at this moment in time in our history. So our goal here tonight is to really talk about the mindset of boards when it comes to ethics and conflicts of interest, and to tackle some of the pillars underneath the whole idea of intellectual freedom, how we prevent censorship, and how we respect privacy through the decisions being made at the board table. Sarah specializes not only in running a public library system, as Jerry has done in his career and I currently do now, but she's serving on the Freedom to Read Foundation board. She chairs a committee at the national level on core values of librarianship, longtime intellectual freedom advocate. So we're so pleased to have her join us here tonight. So you see two quotes here from the handbook that Jerry curated for us here this evening. In every decision, trustees should be sensitive to even the appearance of impropriety. And we're going to talk a bit about why that is. I think you can probably figure it out, but we'll touch on how important that is in every decision you're making on behalf of the community, as well as the behavior of the board in general, which is certainly not an individual's ability to influence everyone, but you can be a model, hopefully, for folks who might not be familiar with how to behave on a public library board. We're also going to be talking about free access to information as the cornerstone of the American Public Library. And this is something that can get lost in the shuffle sometimes as we think about all the minutia of the details of the decisions that we make at the board table. But really, at the end of the day, that's what we're here to do, is to uphold the public's right to access information. And how we do that in challenging times like this really matters. So thank you for taking the time tonight to join us for this conversation on these important topics. So at the cornerstone of, I think, a functioning democracy is the issue of trust. When the public has trust in our leaders and our folks who are making decisions about our lives, which you are as public library trustees, you're making decisions that influence folks' ability to access library services, to access technology, information, education, and items that really enrich their life overall as a community. If there is a lack of trust between the community and the board, that can really denigrate the ability for folks not only to access services, but for the library itself to thrive long term. When you lose the trust of the community, they're less likely to vote yes on a tax levy for your library, less likely to volunteer to help out at the library, less likely to say good things about you, so other folks might not think it's a great place to go. So the demeanor of the board, how you conduct the business, how you stick to the principles that underpin what makes a good public library function in today's society, these things all have a reflecting pool effect on the library's ability to thrive. So Jerry's going to be talking quite a bit about ethics and conflicts of interest, which are things that kind of flow through many of the things that you do on the board. But what we really want you to think about tonight is your adherence to ethics, to your respect of surfacing conflicts of interest, to respecting the core values of librarianship, and at the end of the day, making sure you're respecting the right of all community members to access library services, not just those that might already use the library or who reflect the folks that are on the board or who complain the loudest at a board meeting's public comment period. We have to always keep in mind the library is for everyone, and that can get very challenging sometimes with some of the decisions that you're faced with at the board table. So Jerry, why don't you kick us off talking about ethics and conflicts of interest?
First, Rebecca, I'd like to kick us off by saying thank you to you again. I think maybe 2 years ago, we talked about the new edition of the Trustee Handbook, and we said, well, what do trustees, what do they really want to know? And the answer was, let's ask them. And your response was, let's do this. It took us a little while to get it together with COVID and whatnot, but COVID probably gave us the Zoom answer. So thank you to you. And once again, you had an incredibly articulate introduction. And I would like to take off on the trust issue right away. The Board of Regents has given you a very short, simple, and challenging job description. And one of those job descriptions is that you have the duty of loyalty. Your community, in one way or another, has entrusted you as an individual and as a board with their most treasured institution, their library, which is the institution of optimism that shows that they believe in their community and the future of their community. And that's up to you to honor and to fulfill that trust that they've given to you. So when it comes to things like the appearance of conflict and ethics and whatnot, if you're not willing to put your personal needs and your family's personal needs aside for the greater good of your community, then you need to think about whether you should be a trustee of your community library. So let's move right into the appearance of conflict, or just conflict in it itself. The duty of loyalty basically is the foundation for conflict of interest problems. And then we all have them. Most of you are in small libraries, and so you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. You're related to a lot of friends. Some people are more than happy to help the library. But the New York State General Municipal Law and the New York State Nonprofit Corporations Law give us very specific guidelines to avoid the conflict and also the appearance of conflict. Now, in the handbook, we mentioned that the number one complaint that the New York State Education Department gets about libraries is that there's conflict of interest, that you hire your family, that you do business with your friends. Now, whether that's true or not is not relevant. What's relevant is your community members think it is. And so our conversation tonight is going to focus around making sure the appearance of conflict does not exist, that you think about that all the time in every decision you make, in every contract you write, in every favor you ask, and everything you do as a trustee. Because in our society today, frankly, many people assume conflict. They assume there's corruption in government, and frankly, they're not wrong. Not necessarily in libraries, but I will speak from 40 some odd years of experience. There has been, and there is, conflict of interest in libraries in the state of New York, and some of which is illegal. So we will talk a little bit about a conflict of interest policy. You all must have the conflict of interest policy, and it needs to conform with the New York State Nonprofit Corporation Law. I assume you all do. It's very clear. We have the website on the state library library development page that gives you the outlines for that. And there are many great samples, which we, of course, will provide for you with our toolkit after the program tonight. But in the handbook, we also talk about nepotism, and we're implying, and I'm not implying, I'm saying nepotism can also look like a conflict of interest. It is not unusual in libraries in the state of New York for trustees to hire friends and neighbors and children. It is not advisable. If you do not have an anti-nepotism policy in your library, you have a responsibility as a trustee to bring it up. And we actually have a question later on this evening that someone says, I'm a new trustee, that's what they do here. And blame it on us. The trustee handbook, which is accepted by the controller of the state of New York and the commissioner of education of the state of New York, agrees with us insofar as nepotism and anti-nepotism. And lastly, I've said this before at least 3 times on this program, your kids don't want to work at the library. Let them go work at McDonald's or Taco Bell or whatnot. It's embarrassing for them and it's difficult for everyone around them. So please be aware of that. Now, code of ethics, again, this is slightly different in our library world. You have a conflict of interest policy, but we also recommend and urge you to have a code of ethics. And I mean a code of ethics, which is basically defining the appropriate professional behavior of the Board of Trustees. And Rebecca, the next slide, I think, shows an example that the American Library Trustee United for Libraries offers. It's a public library trustee ethics statement. Now, it's important that, again, you model good behavior. And this helps you. It gives you the guidelines to existing trustees and to new trustees about what's important, what's expected of you. And some of the things that are touched on here, which we, of course, we'll come back to later in the evening, are trustees should not expect special treatment by the library. In other words, oh, you don't have to pay fines, you're a trustee. Well, if you still have fines, and many of our libraries are getting rid of fines, that's not right. Oh, trustees' kids should become pages. That's not right. Individual trustees have the right to say whatever they want about the library and the public. That's not right. Trustees can only speak when they're given on behalf of the library, when they're given permission by the entire library board. So there's a lot of things there that deal with your behavior. We urge you to have a code of ethics in addition to your conflict of interest policy. And I know we have some questions about that later on that we'll get more in the weeds on it, but I think it's important for you to understand that define acceptable behavior. Rebecca?
Yeah, I'll just add on to this one. This is one of those things that I think we've mentioned earlier in the series, that not everyone has had the experience of serving on a board before. They might not have seen good board practices or good board behavior and practice. So this gives folks who are new to board service a fighting chance of what's expected. It also helps you deal with problematic behavior further on down the road. There might be kind of the mind meld that we all understand certain behavior might not be acceptable, but holding someone accountable for unacceptable behavior becomes more, I think, procedural when you're in a board setting, particularly in an elected board setting. So a code of ethics that everyone has reviewed and signed off on before starting their term, even if you've been on the board a long time, maybe refreshing everyone's signature every term they serve, is a good way to help that good culture, that good governance culture, either develop or continue on your board. So I know we've got a lot of questions related to this one. So Jerry, I'm just going to go on to our next slide. If that's okay?
Yes, please. No, we'll go on. I start this one off. Without this First Amendment to the Constitution, there would be no Constitution. Those of you who are history majors understand that. There would be no United States of America. This is a very critical foundation of our country. It's also something that we have great difficulty following. To this day, we really are very uncomfortable with freedom of speech. It's the truth, because we don't like to hear what we don't want to hear. I'm speaking as a normal human being in this country, but without this principle, we don't exist as a country. And without this principle, public libraries don't exist in this country. So though it's awkward sometimes, and it might be uncomfortable for you as a board to stand up for the First Amendment, I suggest that you join Thomas Jefferson and James Monroe and all of our founding fathers to uphold the conditions, the foundations of our country. And this is so important because libraries are, I'm going to get a little poetic here. I'm going to paraphrasing Thomas Jefferson. We don't need the blood of tyrants and patriots to refresh the tree of liberty. We need free expression and respect for each other's opinions and to learn from each other in an open society that can speak freely and share their thoughts and ideas and hopes and dreams. And that's what libraries are all about. And that's why America continues to be a great country. It's this dynamic tension of a lot of different points of view and sharing them and giving respect to each other. Enough said, lecture over. Next. So to follow up on what I was just saying, the question that we started in the very first program was, why does your library exist? And again, it's important for you on a regular basis, perhaps once a year, to talk as a board about the mission of the library. And you're a trustee to fulfill that mission. That's your job. That's tough. If your mission believes in the First Amendment of the United States of America, the Constitution of the United States of America, then you need to protect that, and you need to live that, and you need to model that. But in order to do that, you need to have strong policies and procedures to deal with the challenges, because as you well know, we're challenged all the time about freedom of speech. And so though we talked about policies and procedures, last month, it's important that you review them. It's important that you understand them, and it's important that your community knows what those policies are. And they must be on your website, folks. That's now a minimum standard. And part of that is challenges to materials. You need to understand the process, and you need to understand that it's okay for people to challenge what's in the library, because that's part of the First Amendment. They need that process, and you need to respect them for their questions and their challenges, and you need to take it seriously and go through a process in an open and thoughtful way. Now, there are great models of that, and most of your libraries have a good materials challenge policy. As a trustee, read it again, understand it. If you haven't had challenges, you will. Trust me, you will. And you need to be ready. And it sometimes they're very easy challenges. They're like, the catcher in the rye, to get ancient here. And sometimes they're rather challenging because some of the materials will make you uncomfortable. I'm not saying they will make you uncomfortable as because of your own beliefs and life. So take a hard look at that. Understand what those challenges, those policies say, and learn them. The library is a limited public forum. We're not going to get into great legal detail on this, but it's not a public forum. It's not, nobody can stand on a soapbox and start lecturing in the middle of your library. You have the right and the duty to set policies for the use of your library. They need to be consistent. They may not be discriminatory, but when we go back to the meeting we had last month about policies, you need to have good policies. And you need to understand that those policies might lead you to be uncomfortable. And the most classic one is meeting room policies about who can meet at your library. So take a look at them, look at good models, understand that sometimes a group might want to meet at your library and you do not like what they're going to say. And your community will not like what they're going to say. And yet your responsibility, if they meet your policies and follow your procedures, is to allow their free speech. That's tough. I'm going to leave First Amendment audits to Rebecca and her further comments, because frankly, I was lucky enough to retire before they started doing it.
So First Amendment audits is something that, while has been around a long time, we're seeing certainly a pickup in them in libraries over the past 2 years. And if you're not familiar with this, we would suggest that you Google it. You'll find it on YouTube. You'll see an individual in the community come into a public building. Sometimes it's a library, and they're filming. They're filming folks in that space, and they're looking for someone to challenge them so they can explain the First Amendment to you and their rights under the First Amendment. So Casey's going to share a link in the chat box right now, because this is definitely a trending issue in libraries right now. So it'd be a good thing to be up on. There's a great article from Deborah Caldwell Stone, who's the director of the Office of Intellectual Freedom at the American Library Association. She explains what the First Amendment audit is, what the rights of folks are who engage in this behavior, and also really strong tips for library staff of what to expect, how to respond, and what the rights of the library are, and the rights of the other patrons in that space when this happens. From our own experience here in the Mid-Hudson Library System, this article has been invaluable. It's really helped to I want to say, diffuse tension amongst First Amendment auditors and staff are educated about what this is, what to expect, how to handle the situation. It de-escalates it very quickly. The person usually wanders away because they're not getting the conflict they were hoping for in most cases. But this, your mileage may vary depending on the person who walks through your door to do this activity. But we stuck it here on this slide under intellectual freedom because it goes back to the whole tenet of respecting the First Amendment. And sometimes you not agreeing with the person across from you on a particular topic or behavior, but recognizing that free speech is protected in this country and that free people read freely. That's something that I always remember from a visit to a library out in San Francisco. It was a private library and they had this neon sign that just flashed, "Free people read freely." And I'm like, yeah. Like, that's what we're doing here. We're part of a democracy where if you are trusting of your neighbors, you are informing yourself of issues, you need to understand opposing viewpoints to make good decisions on behalf of yourself and your family and your community. The library should be that place where you can learn in a way that is, hopefully in the language we used in the Trustee Handbook, non-judgmental, in a way that allows you to develop your own thinking, your own thought patterns, and to do so in a way where you've trusted the information you've received because the library staff and the library as an institution are trustworthy, which goes back to that first slide we had here tonight. So it's not just the trust of the board from a governing perspective. It's the behavior of our staff on the front lines who may not have gone to library school or had that crash course in the First Amendment. They need to understand some of those building blocks of this democratic institution, which is the public library, which truly is uniquely American. We often focus on the things we don't like about our country, but when we think about the things we love about living in the United States, public libraries are something that I think we should be extremely proud of. I know I'm speaking to a choir of folks who are already convinced of this as well, but this is the kind of stuff that people don't always understand when they're bringing their kids to story time or checking out the latest new release, that there's a much deeper core of being that we have as public libraries, and accessing to that information to help make good decisions, regardless of the popularity of a viewpoint, an author, or a subject matter, is incredibly important to retain the integrity of. And we don't want to lose sight of that as we perhaps trend more towards popular reading libraries and cultural centers. That still has to be at the heart of a lot of the work that we do. The very basics of the human condition require that human dignity be respected in some of these situations. It ties right into the last topic of the evening, which is privacy. As we think about how to function in this world as a human, the need to respect people's privacy is a fundamental human right. We were just, I helped with the class that Jerry developed for Long Island University. And in the semester that we just had, we talked about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how library services speak to people's rights at the very basic nature of being a human. You need to have privacy in your life. You need to have the freedom to explore ideas, to maybe dance when nobody's watching. There's a very famous research project that indicates once people realize they're being watched, they change their behavior. They might not do that dance. They might not seek out that information. So privacy is fundamental to knowledge-seeking behavior, which is what libraries need to be prepared to help with. So as we think about the importance of privacy, it's another thing that it feels like behind the scenes of some of the decisions you're making at the board table. But there's state law that protects library records and patron privacy and their use of the library. And this might be something that I know we've touched on earlier in the series. We really wanted to be excruciatingly clear about it. It's not optional. It's state law to respect the privacy of patrons. So staff need to be trained on this law. It needs to be built into your policies. Very rarely do we suggest that you restate law in your policy. This is one of the few exceptions where we do think this law should be restated in your policy to make sure it's surfaced high enough that your staff are acutely aware of it and its impact on services. If folks think they're being spied on or what they're borrowing or viewing on the library's computers might be reported to an authority, or it might impinge on their working relationship with their employer or denigrate the relationship in and their family. These are all things that provide barriers to access to information, to knowledge, to, I think, that sense that you have the right to educate yourself and to educate your family in a way that helps you live a healthier life. So when you read the Civil Practice Laws and Rules, section 4509, one of the key things that was pointed out to me early in my work in the Mid-Hudson Library System is there's no age limit on the respect of privacy of library patrons. So this means kids and teenagers have the right to privacy as well, and that needs to be respected in library policies and procedures. So this can absolutely rub up against common sense sometimes when we're issuing cards to perhaps a 4-year-old who might not have the agency to keep track of all those books on dinosaurs they just took off. And you've got a harried mom or dad in front of you who are just trying to get those books back to you, and they need to know what they were. But truthfully, if that card was issued to the child and not the parents, you cannot tell them what that kid took out. And that might seem like an extreme example, but it becomes very serious very quickly when we start talking about kids in their teenage years, as they're becoming more aware of their sexuality, of their political inclinations, of their choices they're making about their family life or their future in college or not going to college. These all become this emerging adult issue where libraries are a respected place for kids to start to come into that their own and to figure out self-determination issues. Of course, we all want to keep kids safe. And so finding that balance of respecting kids' privacy and their safety while respecting the core values of librarianship becomes a very tough issue for a lot of folks. So education in this area is paramount. It's very important. Revisiting of policies that respect patron privacy are extremely important. And also having a companion policy to manage law enforcement inquiries is necessary. I think we talked about this a little bit during the policy class, but we just want to remind you these things go hand in hand. There's certain circumstances in which a law enforcement officer may come into the library asking for records of who read this book or who used this computer last, or what did this particular person do in the library. And without the proper court order, the library is legally bound not to comply with that request. So making sure staff are aware of that is going to be extremely important to avoid perhaps a public relations nightmare or a damaging of the relationship with your local police department or the state troopers barracks in your region. These are things that can cause a lot of tension in a local community when not carried out properly. So as a board, finding that balance of the respect of patron privacy, dealing with the realities of running a public library, respecting the rights of law enforcement to do their jobs as well, is a very careful balance. So this one definitely takes, I think, a little more study than some of the other areas that we've talked about when it comes to policy. We want trustees to have a deep understanding and respect for privacy and why it matters. Casey's actually going to be sharing a link to an organization that has mapped all of the elements of the UN Declaration on Human Rights to the issue of privacy to help you kind of just get that deeper understanding of privacy and how it impacts people's lives. So no small things that we're talking about here tonight. Jerry, did you want to add anything on the privacy front or any more on intellectual freedom?
Just going back to something that we mentioned last month regarding policies and procedures, it is absolutely imperative that at some point in time, your director goes over with your staff what they should do when a police or a detective walks in the door and wants information. It's scary. And if your staff knows exactly, okay, this is what I do, this is what we've talked about, it's going to relieve a lot of tension and a lot of problems. And it goes back to doing drills. And having been through that a number of times and having my staff go through that, it's important. It's down to the staff level. It's up to you to give them the comfort that they're doing the right thing. And that's up to the director, and the board has to back up the director and make sure that those policies and procedures are in place. That's it.
So before we jump into the questions this evening, I wanted to kind of break rank with what we've done in the past and just note that this particular session is dealing with much thornier issues than many of the other sessions that we've done. We've talked a lot about very technical issues related to facilities and human resources and what the law is in those areas. In this particular session, we're talking about fundamental principles that guide not only the design of libraries as institutions, but as our country as well as rubbing up against some really hot topics in the current events of our world today. So we just want to note, we're going to be extremely respectful of the questions we're receiving here tonight, as always, but to understand that we might also touch on some tough topics tonight. So Ron, I'm going to turn it back over to you to moderate our questions for this evening.
Fantastic. My favorite part of the evening. And we do have a handful of questions that have come in so far on the Q&A. Just a reminder to everybody, if you go ahead and click on that Q&A button, you can shoot your question over to us. We may not get to all of them tonight, but we will keep an eye on those so we can answer them in the future. To start out, Jerry actually did a little bit of research for us from a question that came up during the last session. So returning to a timely question from last month, an issue was raised about whether a trustee must sign the library's adopted code of ethics. At the time, we were reluctant to offer a definitive answer without knowing the legal structure of the library and seeing the context of the requirement. To quote the policy in question, it is mandatory that trustees sign the policy upon being sworn in or within 3 days of being sworn in. Failure to sign this policy as prescribed may result in the removal from the Board of Trustees. Jerry, I know you looked into this a bit. Could you help us out understand it a little bit better?
Well, actually, this is really interesting, I have to say, because when it was posed to us last month, Rebecca and I were a little bit reluctant to venture definitive answers because we didn't know what the structure of the library was, first of all. And we weren't quite sure what the policy actually said. And so let's just get back to the concept. This is a code of ethics and not the conflict of interest policy. But this is, we thought this was rather unusual, but it turns out it's not. There are a number of code of ethics of libraries in the state of New York that do require the board, the trustee, new or re-elected, to sign that code. And the only deviation between this and the ones we found is the ones we found give a 30-day window, which is probably based on the oath of office requirement rather than 3 days. I'm not going to speculate where it happened to the zero there, but be that as it may. So first of all, this particular library is a public library, but actually this becomes kind of moot insofar as this requirement of signing it. Libraries in our state of New York, insofar as conflict of interest, are subject to the not-for-profit corporation law. But for code of ethics, they have the right under both general municipal law to establish a code of ethics that's appropriate, that talks about appropriate behavior, appropriate professional behavior of the trustees. And so it's prevalent and frankly, well recommended that in addition to your conflict of interest policy and procedure and reporting as required under not-for-profit corporation law, that you follow the guidelines as was on that third or fourth slide we had from the American Library Association, the United for Libraries, that you have a code of ethics which determines and discusses trustee behavior. That said, this whole concept problem about signing is moot because under New York State general municipal law, it specifically says under general municipal law, section 806, subdivision 2, no signatures are necessary. Indeed, no acknowledgement is necessary for this to be policy, to be something that is enforceable. It does require that the trustees and or staff know about it and it be informed of it. But if it's a policy, the Board of Trustees, and this policy happened to be approved a year ago and apparently gets revised and approved every year, that is a binding policy. Now, I doubt, this is a person, I'm not an attorney, one would doubt that just the failure to sign is not going to result in the trustee being evicted from office, or at least it won't stand up before the Commissioner of Education. However, if you add that and violation of the Code of Ethics, then that adds a little more weight to it. Bottom line is, you have a Code of Ethics, whether you sign it or not, it applies to you. You must obey it, or it will be enforced. And the enforcement process and procedures are outlined in this particular code of ethics. And in New York State education law under Ed Law 226, I believe it's subdivision 8. So other than that, this code of ethics was perfectly normal, with a little more elaboration in the areas of the trustee speaking is not allowed to speak on behalf of the library without specific permission of the entire board, and that the trustee does not have the authority to order or command individual staff members, which is something that you will also find in the ALA Code of Ethics and in the Trustee Handbook very clearly. That is bad practice, and it's just not your job to start ordering around staff members or speaking outside of school, as it were, in the community about the library. You're a trustee, you're a member of a team that has collective authority. So what that library does with the signature requirement or not, they can ask for it. The trustees can sign or not. It doesn't matter. The Code of Ethics still applies to them. Rebecca, do you have anything to say, add to that?
Yeah, I just want to thank the trustee who sent it in for us to take a look at, because I just wanted to share that in this example of a code of ethics, it noted the hearing process for removal of a trustee, which for elected trustees is really critical. And association libraries can adopt that process as well if your trustees aren't elected. But noting that the burden of proof, right, is part of a hearing. So if the only caveat was you didn't sign this document, I don't think many reasonable people would say, oh, we're removing you for that, right? So I do think that it was really key. It said you may be removed from the board, and then it was then followed by a hearing process to explain that. So I think, sure, go ahead, don't sign it, but you're still going to be held to it.
Yeah, I think Rebecca agrees with this. We would suggest that you take the signature requirement and just put it, have the signature at the end of it. Just actually the Code of Ethics by the United for Libraries that we showed on an earlier slide. We didn't show the last page, which just has a signed, meaning that you read and understand it. That's typical to have that signature there, but not required, not in New York State.
Thanks for doing some background research on that one, you two. I really appreciate it. The next question that I have for you, and this one is talking about conflicts of interest. So in the trustee handbook, it says, in this context, trustees or their families may not enter into a business relationship with the library, even if they are providing a service below cost. And the question is, does this apply to association libraries as well?
Short answer is yes. The conflict of interest law that Jerry mentioned before, which was enacted in 2014 by the Not-for-Profit Revitalization Act, applies to both public and association libraries. So that's one of those areas that it doesn't matter which type of library you are. The conflict of interest policy and the particulars of that policy, which are required by law, need to be followed by all types.
Yeah, and I just to add to that, I believe, and Rebecca, please. Unlike the general municipal law, that such a relationship could happen as long as the person involved, the trustee, is not involved in the discussion at all. We don't recommend that, and they need to disclose that openly, publicly. It's just very bad practice, and this goes back to our first slide. The number one reason people complain about libraries in the state of New York is because of these conflicts. So please don't do that. A public library, in no way, shape, or form are you permitted under general municipal law to have that kind of conflict or the appearance thereof. I'm not sure, our job here is not to tell you what you can get away with, what the best practices are. So please be careful with that and just avoid it at all costs.
While we're talking about conflicts of interest, this next question I have actually relates a little bit to one of the questions in the Q&A section too. But does a trustee having a conflict of interest mean that they can no longer serve on the library board?
So I would say no, it depends, which I know you all love when we say that, but it does depend, right? Is if you've surfaced the conflict and the rest of the board is aware of it and they've discussed it, and it might be a minor conflict, it could be a really dire conflict. That would be a group discussion to decide, you know, if that's minor enough, we can just have you recuse yourself from a discussion or a vote on this issue, or we need to have you leave the room during discussions related to this, or it might be a conflict it's too embedded in the organization. This is where when libraries don't have an anti-nepotism policy and you've like a spouse is working for the library and decision after decision might affect their workplace or their salary, and you find that as a trustee, you have to recuse yourself again and again, then you're getting into the area where it's time to step down from the board. That conflict of interest is just too deep to allow you to stay on. But I would say it's really about that conversation about the depth of the conflict of interest.
Rebecca, you got it right on the head. Leaving the room is the best advice, or leaving the board if it's a relative. And I actually am aware, and I believe there's somebody on here right now that on the show right now that brought this to my attention, where a trustee had his wife working there, which is not illegal, but he refused to absent himself when it came to salary negotiations. That's wrong. I'm sorry. There's no question about that. So in that case, you should not be on the board.
Continuing with conflicts, each year trustees fill out a conflict of interest statement. Good. And they put not applicable for potential conflicts. In a community our size, and I'm guessing it's small, it is hard to believe that they have none. Are there examples of potential conflicts that would exist on a board that we may not be considering?
You know, I get this question a lot about, I feel like people are trying to manufacture conflict, maybe in hopes of like, I could get off the board if this actually worked out. But I find like the two general types of conflict to be aware of are financial and familial. So if you've got a financial conflict where you are benefiting financially by your service on the board, or a family member is financially benefiting, those are the primary concerns. So I think even in a small town, it's certainly possible that you might not be affiliated with a business or sole proprietorship that would benefit from the library. It's also possible you might not have a family member working at the library. So if in writing that person has said NA, no conflict, I'd say let it go. If the people, I think the more important thing is education for trustees about what is a conflict of interest. I think we make a lot of assumptions that people understand what a conflict of interest is. So most frequently I'll get questions about can someone serve on both like the town board and the library board? And again, it depends. Are you getting funding directly from the town in which they make the final decision versus are they just a liaison in a situation where there's a public vote on the budget? So it can depend, but I think it's totally feasible. Even in a small town, there might not be any conflicts of interest.
Rebecca, you know, I've used an example before that fits into this perfectly, and that is a trustee being the president of the local Little League and asking to use some parking spaces for a trailer for the baseball season. That would not come up on a conflict of interest questionnaire, but when it came up at a board meeting, he had to go get a cup of coffee.
It's a special favor, right? Like, are you getting special treatment because you're on the board?
They're on different boards. That's fine.
But again, it's about special treatment. Are you getting special treatment because you're on the board? Then you should be asking some questions.
Jerry mentioned nepotism a couple times as we were going through the slides and answering some of the earlier questions. In this question, there's a long-standing nepotism situation in our library that the board does not address because there has not been a problem in the past. How should a new trustee think about this situation, knowing it will be unpopular to suggest resolving the situation?
Blame it on us.
My first thought was, I have a question for that person. I don't know if we can get that answer at this point, but whether or not there was an anti-nepotism policy in place when the situation was created. I think if it was created in opposition to an existing policy, 100% that should be brought up and people should be held accountable. If there was no policy in place and the board did not enforce that issue and it arose during that era of the board, I think you'd still want to surface the fact that there should be no direct reports that have family ties or relationship ties. that is like a lawsuit waiting to happen when things go south. So particularly in the romantic relationship situation, but that's separate from this nepotism question.
I guess my point when I said blame it on us is, if you're a trustee, you're not supposed to be popular. You're supposed to do your job. And it's not always easy. And I think you might be surprised that they'll consider it seriously because you're bringing it up. So
I thought people join library boards to become popular. That's not true.
wait till the first intellectual freedom challenge.
Should a code of ethics be adopted as a standalone policy, or is it something that should be included in the library's bylaws?
I would say standalone. I have this aversion to trying to treat the bylaws like everything in the kitchen sink. I think that should really be set as the institutional charter rather than, I shouldn't have said charter, but organizational origin document in terms of how the board runs itself. The code of ethics isn't like an appendix perhaps to that, but I would say you want to keep it separate, as bylaws usually have a higher standard in which to amend them. And the bylaw, I don't think the code of ethics needs to be held to that same standard, but I don't think there's a right or wrong answer, just a preference.
I agree.
Great. So this one gets into the library materials that you had both mentioned earlier on. So this library has a reconsideration of library materials policy as suggested by ALA, with a form for people to fill out to challenge a title. Should a library really be reconsidering materials? This is mainly a tool to acknowledge a complaint, but we have no intention of actually removing a title from our collection unless there are factual inaccuracies.
100%. Yes, you should. You absolutely should. You want to hear what people have to say. That's part of a functioning democracy, right? Is helping people be heard. That doesn't mean you might agree with them, but I think they have the right to be heard on a situation. We've certainly had situations in which a book was brought to the board's attention, and honestly, it was something the staff missed, that it was factually inaccurate, or it was shelved in the wrong collection area of the library. So I think not assuming a combative situation, although the trend today would probably prove me wrong. Most of them are pretty combative, but not always. So I think you always want to be respectful in the exchanges with the public. And if you have that process in place, you better respect it. I think that's the thing that's been most shocking in the national stories about school districts that are banning books. They're not following their own process. It's just like what we told you when we talked about the Office of the State Comptroller doing audits of internal financial controls. One of the biggest problems is boards not following their own process and their own policy. So if you've got that policy, you've got that form, and you've got a process to respect that form, follow through. That's what it's there for.
I can only just resonate what Rebecca said. Respect your public, even if you don't agree with them. That's what you're there for. That's actually leadership. You know, that don't do how don't follow find your good models. And a good model would be listening to other people and learning from them. You never know, there might be a reason. And many of us have lived through that they had a point. You know, maybe you didn't agree with them and maybe you didn't take the book out, but they had a point and it was worth listening to.
The next one, speaking of listening, does a board have the authority to tell our director to not purchase titles that would be potentially controversial in our small community?
You start this one.
All right. So censorship is a slippery slope. So once you make a decision to pull something out based on what criteria, I'm very curious, you've opened the door to a real mess. So I would say that would you have the power to do that? Probably, yeah. Should you? Not without following your own policy for requesting something to be reconsidered. So I think it's something to be extremely careful about. I don't think you should be cherry picking stuff without the criteria used of your collection development policy.
Go back to that slide with the First Amendment, folks. Yes, you can. No, you shouldn't. Yes, it's going to be difficult from time to time.
This question has come up. Banned books, challenge books have been in the news quite a bit recently. And this question is asking, if a book is banned in another community, does our library have an obligation to take some form of action? So it sounds like maybe a neighboring library, maybe a school district has challenged or banned a book. Does this library need to take any action on that?
I think your action should be to review your collection development and request for reconsideration review policy. I don't think you should ban the same book if your community is not complaining about it or following your process for doing so. I don't think there's preemptive censorship to avoid being the target of this conversation. If the conversation needs to happen, it needs to happen in your community too. And that's why you have the process to manage it. But I would not do reactive censorship just for the same reason we talked about earlier.
You know, Rebecca, I read that one a little different,
Oh.
maybe my naivety. I was wondering if they were taking action was to protest the book banning in the other community. That's up to you guys. That you're not elected to comment on other libraries' actions, and we didn't know if it was a public library, a school library, and whatnot. But there are many areas and activities you can do to stand up for First Amendment rights. I know Sarah's going to chime in a little bit because the American Library Association takes a very activist role in this, and many libraries do. But that's I think, from my perspective, I think that's a local political decision whether you should be commenting on a neighboring community's actions.
Well, I mean, Jerry,
if you really believe they were wrong, then you can have a nice book display of that book and have the author come and visit. But
well, Jerry, to your point, that's the big headline in library land this week, right? Is the New York Public Library in Brooklyn offering for the next month library cards to anyone in the country to come read those books that are being banned in other parts of the country. So there's certainly commentary, I think, that can be made in terms of reinforcing the right of people to access materials that other communities are not respecting. So I think if you want to double down on defending your people's right to read, we'll back you up on that.
There you go.
This next one, I love it when people quote the Trustee Handbook, because then you know they read it, which is great. The Trustee Handbook says public libraries play a unique role in the support and preservation of democracy by providing open, non-judgmental institutions where individuals can pursue their own interests. Very good quote. What advice do you have for a library director that works with a board who is only interested in the library providing one viewpoint, specifically a conservative religious viewpoint?
I'll start this one. As a library director, one of your jobs and responsibilities is to educate your library trustees and your community about what the purpose of libraries are in the United States of America. And they are not to pursue one point of view. If your trustees won't buy into that, then this person is asking what they do as a director. Get another job, because that's not what libraries are all about. And if you're at such a philosophical conflict with your board of trustees, this is not a good partnership. So, but your first job is to educate them. Rebecca, what do you want to say? Huh?
I second what you just said, Jerry. Nicely done.
Okay.
This one goes the opposite direction too, or kind of in the same vein. So we have a progressive community that only checks out liberal leading titles. Considering the intensity of conservative publications, what is a strategy? What is a strategy to offer a balanced perspective to our community without upsetting our current patrons?
That one's all yours, Rebecca.
I appreciated this question because I've certainly had this situation in some of my libraries. And I think sometimes we need to step back and really think about how we're defining community. Are you defining community based on who happens to walk through your door? Who looks like the board does? I mean, I think that we often have a very narrow view of who we're serving based on who currently has a library card. And we need to step back and recognize we serve the whole community. And the fact that you're seeing primarily books being checked out that have a liberal viewpoint might be because folks that have a more conservative viewpoint haven't found what they were hoping for on the shelves of your library. So if you haven't developed a collection that is speaking to opposing viewpoints, that has actually created the opportunity for folks to learn about different ideas on alternate spectrums of the conservative and liberal spectrum, that can be a self-fulfilling prophecy that you've built into your collection. So I think being very careful to not paint a broad brush of who is in your community without truly looking at demographics and political affiliations, and making sure you understand that not everyone walks through your door represents who lives in your community. That takes some study, and it's, you know, a big reason why folks go to library school, to understand how to build library collections that are responsive to all folks in the community, not just those that currently use the library.
I would only say that you're giving liberals a bad reputation if you say they're going to get upset by reading stuff that they don't agree with. I hope that's not the way the whole world acts. So,
Can I jump in here also?
Yeah, thank you,
yes,
Sarah.
please, Sarah.
I think you need to look at your community plan. I mean, if you're providing support for students, they need to be able to get resources to do their due diligence on their papers. You really need to have I'm going to say a more balanced collection, even though libraries of our size, I think, can't have everything on their shelves, because there's just not that space to have everything. But you need to look at your collection development policy as well, and how you determine what you're buying and what your criteria is to buy materials. Then I think you do have an obligation to have books or materials that touch upon all things.
So this is the first time we're seeing Sarah on camera here. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to know Sarah. She's the executive director of the Southern Adirondack Library System, a longtime colleague of many of us who work in systems, but a real leader nationally on the topic of intellectual freedom, from service on the Intellectual Freedom Committee at both the New York Library Association and the American Library Association, to her current service on the foundation, the Freedom to Read Foundation, which does excellent work, and her very recent election by her national peer group to serve on the executive board of the American Library Association. We're just very grateful, Sarah, that you gave us some time here tonight to help us with some of these questions.
Oh, and I'm honored to be in your midst. So I hope I can add content and help. I'm also an elected public library trustee, so I do sit in 2 different chairs.
And Sarah, while we have you here, I have a couple questions that you may be able to chime in on and help out with. But the next question we have on our list is, should a library adopt a resolution similar to the American Library Association's Library Bill of Rights and Freedom to Read statement?
I'm going to say it should be one of the documents that your board does approve. It's just one of the Library Bill of Rights is a foundation document. It's like our Constitution. And I think that those are documents that need to be adopted, as well as you need to keep on looking back, because they are amended and revised more often now than ever before. So the answer is yes, please.
I'd like to
Very
chime
good.
in a little bit, having dealt with a lot of boards that over my career. Some board members are going to be uncomfortable with everything that's in these, just like some Americans are uncomfortable with the Bill of Rights if they actually read them. And the very process of reviewing them as a library board gets you back to what the purpose of the library is. And I hardly recommend boards that read the darn things and talk about them. And if you're uncomfortable, have that debate in your library board meeting and with your director and with other folks, because they're foundational documents. And just like the big Bill of Rights is sometimes uncomfortable, so are these. But that's what they're there for. And that's what these Library Bill of Rights are established. They're based on fundamental principles of our country. So I couldn't agree more with Sarah.
I'll just share that I've been in board meetings where there was arguments over adopting the Library Bill of Rights. And I think it's important to have that debate, to have those conversations. But it was great. I have to say, it's happened to me 3 times in 20 years. And what we did was we just went article by article through the Library Bill of Rights. And at the end of the day, there wasn't much to argue with, I have to say. You know, defending everyone's right to come in the library regardless of their background. Okay. You know, when you start peeling it back and you really read the language, it's pretty common sense stuff that makes a lot of sense to reasonable people.
And I just want to add one last thing, and I can't agree enough with you, Rebecca and Jerry and Ron. The last thing is there also are interpretations for each part. So it could add light and understanding to the document as well.
This next question I have is, I think it's kind of a tough one. So Sarah, we're going to throw a real hardball at you right away. And you may not be able to answer this fully, but I'll be interested to hear your take on it. What are the reasons for the current trend of book banning across the nation? Are there potentially larger implications for public libraries? Aside from writing policy, are there other activities that we should be taking? So what's with the current trend? Are there larger implications? And what else should libraries be doing?
Oh, Sarah, you're on mute.
I'm so excited with that question. I think it's political. I think it's a climate that's happening in the country right now. I think there are groups that are being very vocal and very loud and have a very strong presence in social media with little sound bites. There are groups like Moms for Liberty, and they're popping up. Chapters are popping up all over New York State and the country. There's another group called I Voter. There's another one. Well, there are a number of them, and a lot of them are being funded by the Heritage Foundation. And that's why I think it's political, and it's just grasping the public. And that's why I think it's happening. I'm going to be probably politically incorrect right now, and I don't understand how in Florida they're banning elementary school math books because they say they are they have critical race theory in a first grade math book. So it's just catching on that way. I'd like to say that there are other groups that you can join. The Freedom to Read Foundation, that's the legal part where they go and they look at state law and federal law and go to court to protect the First Amendment. Another group is called Unite Against Banned Books. It's I'll put the link in. You got the link in there?
Yep.
Thank you. And if you look at their front page, they're saying that 71% of voters oppose efforts to remove books from public libraries. And another poll showed that 67% of voters oppose efforts to remove books from school libraries. So it's my opinion that there are very few very loud voices that are behind it. And it's time to look at our core values and defend people's right to read what they want to read. I'm not saying that libraries tell parents what children should read. That's up to the parent. But it's not up to another parent to tell me what my children should read. And I'll leave it at that, and I'll let you, Rebecca and Jerry, clean up my
let me add an old man's perspective. I completely agree with you. First of all, let's start with that. But I think it's imperative that we, as librarians and as library people and trustees, do recognize that a percentage of the people in our country are afraid. The world is changing. They can't control it anymore. And they're watching it change in a way that they're not comfortable with. Now, I'm not talking about those people that are tapping into that discomfort, fear, or whatever for political gain. And that is an old playbook. This is not new. That's been going on for millennia. But libraries can still provide a place of comfort and understanding to all of the people in our communities. And if we are proactive to every demographic in the community, I think it gives us a little credibility to work with going forward when these challenges come. Because I think, Sarah, you're right. They're managed by certain public special interest groups, and they're tapping into fears of people like me, an old white guy. And our job is to let everybody know that the library is a place that they're welcome. And I think that as long as we keep getting that across and don't think everybody out there is an enemy, that we'll continue being the most credible public institution in America. My thoughts. Rebecca?
Amen.
Good.
You're speechless?
Solid.
Come on.
I mean, I think this is one of those tough things where a lot of library people are very good-hearted and they take things at face value, right? So understanding the political motivations of some of the work that we're seeing here, I think the position that Sarah holds in some of these national organizations where we can see that kind of 30,000 view of what's going on here and tracing the money that's influencing and supercharging really the highest number of book challenges that's been seen in 20 years. That's not something that happens overnight. There's something supercharging that, right? That's not organic. So I think that recognition of what's motivating it. One of the things I love about the model request for reconsideration form, it asks the person who's asking for a book to be reconsidered if they've actually read the item or watched the movie. And in my experience, 90% of the time that person will say, no, I haven't.
No.
They're following the lead of someone else leading them to challenge that item without coming to a full appreciation or understanding of that item personally themselves. And I think that's very critical that we respect people, certainly their opinion, but also the need for people to think for themselves and to encourage that and to, I think, avoid the groupthink that is really gotten, I think, our country into some trouble over the past few years. So I think we just need to encourage people to think for themselves, come to their own conclusions. And that's why public libraries in New York State are so strong, because we're community-based. The idea is the collective wisdom at that table will help come to good resolutions in these challenging situations.
I'm going to echo that again. I think we've learned this over the years doing this stuff. If someone comes in with a complaint, be respectful, ask them why, ask if they've read it, and then learn, try to understand their perspective. And again, libraries are very good one-on-one. We're challenged when it comes to highly funded, targeted organizations. But when you get one of your own patrons in there and they're upset about something and you listen to them, 9 times out of 10, you're making a friend. So I always think we're better one-on-one than we are on a national political level. But because you know what? People love libraries. They know in their heart it's a good institution. So I encourage you to be respectful and listen.
I think that's the key, is to listen, take it seriously, practice, go through practice, work with your trustees, work with me, work with the trustees, and work with the staff so that everybody is on the same page and everybody who walks into the library is treated with respect. If they have questions about why materials are on this shelf. You may have covered this last session, but I just want to say your collection development policy should have it in it that professionals are making the decision of what is on the shelf and that it's vetted using different sources. So it's not just being placed on the shelf. And I think Again, I apologize if you talked about this last time, but you also really need to take a good look at your gift and donation policy so that the same standards of what gets onto the shelf is held for. Just because it's a gift doesn't mean it's going to end up on your shelf.
Sarah, thanks so much for chiming in and helping us with this. I think, Ron, we probably have some questions from the audience at this point. Maybe we could tackle those too.
We do, yeah. Let's go ahead and jump into those. And again, if you have a question, feel free to drop it into the Q&A section. The first one comes from Mari. Is the board president inherently authorized to speak on behalf of the entire board, or must it be authorized per event?
Most libraries adopt a media or spokesperson policy, and I would say the default is going to be the board president. So in the absence of something in writing, I would assume it's the board president. But sometimes there's different folks on your board that are better suited to speak in different situations. So it might be good to confirm if there's nothing in writing, but I'd prefer that you have a policy that makes it clear who the spokesperson is. And then if you want to switch that up for a particular situation, that's certainly the board's prerogative.
And of course, if the board president speaks contrary to what the decisions of the board have been, it's your job as a trustee to call them out.
Our good pal, Matthew Bollerman has a comment for us, and it's about challenges. Yeah, exactly. That's what I thought too. But Matthew's comment is challenges should include programs too. Hauppauge dealt with a program challenge recently, and I know that there have been libraries that have dealt with that too.
Yeah, shout out to Mr. Bollerman. He was actually featured on the news in New York City for defending a program that some folks had been unhappy with in his community. And I just always remember this clip so clearly because he said, who are we to challenge the knowledge in the universe, and really giving people the space and time to learn about something that wasn't maybe popular in the community, but was something of interest to folks. And so that idea of being non-judgmental about what people want to learn, as libraries have evolved over the past 25 years, it's not just about the books. You've now got different format types. You've got not only books on CD or downloadable items, you've also got programs, you've got websites, you've got LibGuides your staff have created. These challenges can come at any of those information delivery systems, shall we say. We certainly have seen a big movement across the country about new electronic resource products like Hoopla, and who's doing collection development in that shared environment when it's not a local decision. How do you defend against challenges in that environment? So it's only getting more complicated. So some of these basic techniques we're sharing here tonight hopefully will serve you well in these alternate types of challenges that I think are only a matter of time before we see coming.
Matt's point is very well taken, because at least during my career in the libraries directly, meeting room use was a big issue. And programs that, you as a trustee must understand your meeting room use policy. It needs to be vetted legally these days. And you need to be consistent, because chances are that a group is going to ask to meet at your library. They're going to do it, and they're going to conform with every bit of your policy, and you're not going to like it. And your community is going to tell you you're not going to like it. And then you have to decide, do you stand for freedom of information and the First Amendment, or are you going to fold? And most libraries actually stand up. And a lot of trustees and library directors have a very uncomfortable time of it, but they know when they go to bed at night that they did the right thing. So good luck with it. It's not easy. And I do know a couple of library directors that got through it and then said they couldn't wait to retirement because there's a lot of pressure. I had one of those instances when I was a young library director, and my board, though they were not happy with their director, did decide that that's what the library stood for. And we all survived to live another day. So good luck with it. Thanks for that question, Matt.
This one's coming in from Nancy. What about the more passive censorship of saying it is not possible to acquire the materials identified? They are academic, and this is a community library with limited resources.
I mean, I have a real problem with that. I think that libraries should be able, I mean, we have an intensely amazing network of interlibrary loan in this country. I mean, you've got your system network, you've got your state network, you've got the OCLC global network. It's virtually impossible to say that you couldn't get something for somebody. So I think, again, it goes back to staff training and the adherence to core principles of what kind of library this is in terms of our ethics and what we stand for. So I think that would be a training issue for staff, but it might be hard for boards to know that kind of behavior is happening. So I will say one of the techniques we use with our libraries is to keep what we call the no log, maybe every twice a year, where staff list every time they had to say no to a patron when you couldn't meet their needs. And it can identify funding issues. It can identify training issues for staff. Sometimes it just identifies customer service training is needed in your organization. But I would say that that's a non-starter for me.
Well, I guess the question would be, if somebody is demanding you add it to your collection, and then it should go according to your collection development policy. If indeed it's an academic textbook and you're a public library, you probably are not going to buy it. But most public libraries, if there's a demand for a book, and I mean more than one demand, one request, they consider it regardless of the subject or topic. But again, if it does not meet your collection collection development policy, then I go with Rebecca, just borrow it.
This one, it looks like it's asking about privacy a bit. What is the procedure when police want to see security camera footage to see who is walking past the front doors of the library when a crime occurred in the neighborhood, for example?
Cool. So you
Get the
should.
subpoena.
You could be hardline and say you will only release video if you have a subpoena. And I'm wondering if any of our lawyer friends are on the line with us today. I'm gonna get my hand slapped here. But just there should be a policy in place about your security camera footage and who has the right to access it. And always remembering that the point of that protective policy is to protect the same thing you're doing with your library record law, which is to protect people's rights to read without feeling like they're being watched. So if there's security footage of the front door, which reveals someone walking in the library, that's not a violation of their rights, but it would be a violation of their rights if your video footage was showing what they were taking off the shelf, what they were looking at on a computer screen. So again, having a good policy that's been vetted by legal counsel is essential.
Rebecca, I agree though we're not attorneys, I agree with your legal, but it's so easy to get a subpoena. It's 5 minutes. But be that as it may, if a crime was committed right in front of your building, be cooperative.
This next person, they put in anonymous, but they must have done this after I said I love it when people quote the trustee handbook. They start by saying, in the trustee handbook, it states, the board president also serves as the primary liaison between the board and the director. What do you recommend doing when the president works with the director and does not communicate with the rest of the board? In many instances, the board is kept in the dark on many issues regarding the library.
It sounds like you need a peer-to-peer conversation. So maybe someone else on the executive board of the library or the vice president or someone else in an officer position needs to speak to the president to let them know that's the perception. That person might not be doing it on purpose. It could just be they're busy and they aren't reporting out the way everyone wished they would, or they may be keeping things from you, but either way, they should be confronted about the issue.
Yeah. And remember that the board president does not command the library director. They communicate the board's wishes to the library director. So if you as trustees do not believe that the board president is communicating with you, you got to call them out. It's that simple.
In a polite way.
Mm-hmm. Well, sometimes.
In a polite way, Jerry.
But I just want to make the point where I don't think it has to be a confrontation where like you call them out in the middle of the bill, like, have a side conversation, sidebar, after the meeting, or, call them up afterwards and say, a couple of us were talking and it seems like we're not getting all the information that you have. Is there anything we can do to improve that? And like I said, most people will be like, oh, wow, thank you for letting me know that. I didn't realize that's what was happening. Other times you're going to have someone who's a megalomaniac that's like, and that's the way I like it. And then you've got a much bigger problem on your hands.
I suspect this is closer to what you just said.
All right. I'm going to try to give people the benefit of the doubt, Jerry.
This one, I don't remember either of you mentioning an ethics board earlier, but I may have just missed it. Does an ethics board need to be created before the need for one arises?
No.
No.
Libraries, there are municipalities sometimes have a board of ethics, the state and your county and whatnot, but if you don't, I believe, I'm trying to remember exactly in the general municipal law, if you don't have one, the board can act as a whole. But it's probably overkill unless you're, municipalities have this all the time, but not small institutions like ours.
Since patrons have the right to privacy, can First Amendment auditors be stopped from filming them?
Go for it.
Sarah, did you want to chime in?
No,
on
no,
this
no.
one?
That's all yours.
So again, let's talk about policy, right? You should have a policy in your policy collection that's really called filming in the library, that makes it clear when it's okay to film and when it's not, and when you're infringing on people's rights. So it's not an on-the-spot judgment by the staff. It's
Right.
something that's been thought through before it happens. So the fact is that a third party can come in and film in that space, but they can't violate other people's rights. So your policy needs to define the rights of those other folks and when to draw the line with a First Amendment auditor. But the fact is, most of the time they're kind of panning across. So it's going to be a little maybe stickier in that situation, but highly recommend that article by Deborah Caldwell Stone from the ALA Office of Intellectual Freedom. She gave excellent advice, practical advice you can copy and paste right into your policy to help with staff training on this topic.
And remember, your policies like that need to be posted. You don't keep them a secret. And I'm aware that most libraries may have a very strict policy about filming children. And but I think if it's well posted and people understand it, my feedback from libraries that have had these First Amendment audits that have the policy, they've trained the staff, it's been not a positive experience, an okay experience.
Sarah, did you want to chime in at all on First Amendment audits?
I think you've covered it all. I put it in the comments section. The time to review your collection development policy and your reconsideration policy is now. Once you're challenged, it's too late. You have to go with what you have. So please, if I could suggest something as a takeaway, please review your policy tonight, this week, and take a look at it and go to your system person to have them review it just to make sure that everything is correct. And then also always share it with your attorney.
Thanks, Sarah. This next one's coming in from Anne. How does having a parent or guardian needing to sign off on a child's library card application impact that child's privacy?
This is one of those sticky ones, right? Because who's going to be financially responsible for the items that kid just took out? So this is why we were, I think I shared kind of that awkward situation. If you've issued the card to the kid, that they have the right to privacy of those titles. The staff have to hand the list of titles to the kid and they then hand it over to the parent or guardian. So I think it's one of those things where we always think about the warm and fuzzy outcome of issuing the kids cards and the amazing experience of kids having that agency to make determinations and their own choices in the library versus the realities of the financial responsibility and the privacy concerns as that child ages.
And I think we have time for, let's see if we can get one more question in here. And this one, well, maybe we'll be able to do two. We'll see. This one may be a roles and responsibilities question. Are trustees able to ask employees work-related questions as long as no directives are involved?
Are they allowed? Yeah, should they? No. Ask the director. I mean, that's what the director is, the chief executive officer. They're the one you hire to manage the place. If you're investigating a complaint, that should be a formal process. So that should be very, 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 cautious on that. And frankly, the code of ethics we talked about earlier forbid that that was part of the behavior policy of trustees. Don't go meddling into what people's jobs are. So I think that's a very bad idea. If you have a problem, bring it to the director. If you don't trust the director to answer your questions, then you've got another problem that's got nothing to do with a staff member on the floor. Rebecca, you got anything to add to that one?
Yeah, I just want to follow up on what you just said. If you're not feeling confident in talking to the director, your time is better spent addressing the director's performance than it is getting that specific answer.
Well said. So articulate.
All right, we'll do one more. And this one, again, is about patron privacy. So police need a warrant to ask library staff about what materials library patron Googled or books they take out. And then that's a question. So police need a warrant to obtain that information, ?
There's a difference between a subpoena and a warrant, but the intent is, yes, they need a court order
And
to obtain information about materials that people are looking at or borrowing.
And what about with mandated reporting? If a library patron may self-harm, do police need a warrant to get that information?
So I'm sorry, Ron, the question is if the police are coming in with concerns about a patron doing self-harm and they think information about what that person has borrowed might help them identify that situation is true or not, that would still fall under, that person's privacy would still be protected.
Yeah. Even in criminal investigations, that kind of information, it's awkward sometimes, but yeah, and it really is not a big deal getting a subpoena if it's justified.
All right, we have a ton more questions that we weren't able to get to tonight. So again, like we say at the end of almost all of these, probably another after party is going to be on the horizon soon to see how many of these that we can tackle that we weren't able to get to tonight. But I want to thank everybody again for coming this evening. I want to especially thank Sarah Dallas for joining us tonight to help us answer some of the intellectual freedom questions that popped up. Rebecca and Jerry, as always, we really appreciate your take on all of these questions. It is fantastic. And this session was recorded and it'll be posted on the Mid-Hudson Library site. So if you want to review it again, or if you have a trustee friend that wasn't able to make it tonight, you can go ahead and send it to them. So thank you, everybody, for being here. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you at next month's session.
Thank you, Ron.
Have a good night, everybody.
Nice to see everyone. Thank you, Sarah.